Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Alexa Hibbard, and I'm a counselor with Your Medicine EAP. And this is our Health Bites series. Thank you so much for joining us today. If it's your lunch hour, hopefully you can settle in and enjoy, and all of your other screens are turned off, and you can focus on this amazing speaker that we have. So, this is a Health Bite surrounded by grief and loss, and I'm really excited that you're here and would love to do some housekeeping things first before I hand it over to Anna, if you don't mind. Please feel free to, if you have any questions or comments, use the Q&A box. That way I can kind of track it and it will be alerted on my end, and I will bring voice to your questions. Anna so graciously said that we can provide them right in the moment. So please feel free if you have, any questions or comments, shared experiences, let me know and I will bring voice to those. So I will give you the floor now. Thank you so much for coming. We were chatting earlier, just these amazing handouts that I will send afterwards via the email that you registered with for Health Bites. I will send those your way. They're awesome. So thank you for being here. The floor is yours. I will stop talking now.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really grateful to be with you all. I'm just going to share my presentation so that we can get started. I know our time is limited. So my name is Anna. I'm a clinical social worker by trade, and I am the manager of the Wilson Support Center and the hospice bereavement team. My focus today is to talk with you about grief and loss, what it is, and how to cope yourself, and also how to help to support others. And I'm sensitive to this also being kind of grief within the workplace adjacent. So I'll also try to touch on that. I know one of the handouts that will be sent out to you after the webinar is specific about supporting grief in the workplace and between colleagues, because that can be an additional filter that we navigate through all this. And towards the end, I'll also touch on the Wilson Support Center and how our grief and loss resources may be helpful to you moving forward. But let's jump right in. My goal really is for you all to leave this time together feeling a little bit more capable when it comes to grief and loss, whether that's for yourself or the people that you love. And when we talk about grief and loss, we often think about a death related loss, the loss of a loved one, the loss of someone close to us, perhaps a pet, a colleague, so workplace loss, something that you're grieving collectively. It could also be an acquaintance, it could be even a public persona. And these are the things that we tend to think about when we're talking about grief and loss. But there is this whole other aspect of grief that also includes more of those non-death related losses we accumulate throughout the course of our life. So with any transition in our lives, with any transition within a relationship, there is inherent loss within that because there's change and adjustment. So these are some other examples of different losses that people face and cope with and are grieving, sometimes without us even knowing. And that can be kind of a difficult part of being in a workplace, is not always having awareness of what people are going through in their personal lives. And so part of this training is just to have some awareness of all of what that might be, so that it doesn't, throw us back on our heels as much if and when we learn of it. When we think about how people respond to grief, it really can be very different from person to person. And even for one person, from loss to loss, the experience of loss that they have when they're younger may be different when they're older. And so those are all things that we take into consideration, where we really don't have assumptions around what someone may or may not be experiencing, because we know that it really is made up of this holistic view of someone's life, of what makes up their well-being, and that it's very individual and it's tailored to them. And if it was the death of a loved one, what is unique about that relationship that may color this experience of grief for them. So the first thing that we often think about when it comes to grief is an emotional response. The idea being that there's this whole spectrum of emotions that we may experience, and it could change from moment to moment. And that can be really overwhelming. And it may be hard for others to understand all the time. It's also difficult, I think, for humans to understand that we can experience a lot of emotions all at once. So it is possible to feel sad, to feel relief, to feel guilt. All of those things can create a really overwhelming and complex experience of grief. But it's something that's very normal and natural. And those emotional aspects really they need to have an outlet. They need to be processed and considered, and they need to be shared. The physical part of grief is also very real, and it can sometimes be overlooked, but there is this real impact of our emotions within our body that can create different emotion or different symptoms that may need medical attention. We certainly always want to have a medical provider taking a look at anything physical, just in case there is something else going on. But grief impacts us physically. It can change our eating habits, it can change our sleeping patterns. It can even create some increased tension or anxiety in the body. We also know that there's a real link with cardiovascular health. So all of those things are just aspects that we want to keep a closer eye on when someone is grieving. The cognitive effect of grief really goes hand in hand with both physical and emotional. Our grieving brains often respond to what's happening in a similar way to our brains responding to trauma. And what I mean by that is that the brain will prioritize what it thinks is most important. And that tends to not be the higher thinking skills that we have. It tends to prioritize instead the essential survival factors of our brain function. And so we're really focused on trying to set those foundational elements of sleep, of nutrition, of rest, um, of socialization. But often we find ourselves in those early days after grief having to use those higher thinking skills like planning and organizing. And that can be especially overwhelming when someone feels like they're not doing that well, they're not doing it right, and they're not feeling like themselves. That's really, really normal. It's very typical, but it's just part of what makes this aspect of grief difficult with our cognitive changes.
Hi, sorry. We just had somebody who just kind of wanted to confirm the experiences that you were saying and all the different levels of, kind of classic grief of the death of a loved one and then grieving. They said a series of cultural losses associated with the pandemic. Workplace has become, less social, more people working from home. So just really responding and acknowledging all of these different areas that it's not so, kind of cut and dry what grief is.
No, not at all. And that's really, I mean, COVID is such a great example because there were so many layers of loss within those years. And if you think about every single time there was a change, right, that was something that we had to contend with. And we didn't know when the next change was going to be. So even if we think more, and we'll get into more of this, but if we think more abstractly about the loss of security, the loss of being able to plan for the future, because we just don't have that reassurance that we can count on it. All of those things are layers of loss. And so we're going to get into secondary losses and we'll pick this right back up. So, just finishing off some of these really common symptoms, we have some real social impact with grief as well. And this can be especially significant because it can really indicate the quality of someone's social support, how they're going to be able to integrate their grief moving forward. So we know that if someone feels that they have a person they can open up to and really be honest about what they're feeling and what they're experiencing, they tend to do a better job of integrating that grief. So there's less friction around all of that versus someone who maybe feels judged for the ways that they're going about their grief. They may feel like their grief is dismissed, or it's seen as not important. It's disenfranchised. They may feel like they have to hide their grief, that they don't have those same outlets. And that makes it that much harder to go through this very natural process without those pieces being affirmed. So this is a big area where our team can help to supplement supports and through formal support like counseling or support groups, or just helping people navigate some difficult conversations, some communication skills around really validating for themselves that what's happening for them is okay, and then being able to sometimes educate the people around them so that they can access some more higher quality support, some support that really resonates for them. Finally, we have the spiritual aspect of grief. And I mean this in the sense of religion and faith, because certain people can certainly feel affirmed in the beliefs and the ways that they've learned about the world that can be affirmed in their experience, and other times it doesn't match what they've grown up believing or what they've developed as part of their values. And so there can be a bit of a crisis with that disconnect. But I also mean this in a more abstract level as well. You know, the spiritual connection that we have as our identity in this world, the connection we have with other people, our role, all of those things can often be turned on its head as well after someone has died, especially, or a major change has happened in life. That rug gets pulled out from underneath you, and all of a sudden you're reevaluating what your priorities are, who you spend your time with, and how you spend your time. So that reprioritization is a very common experience within this spiritual aspect of grief as well. So let's get into those different types of grief and loss, and kind of hit on some of the concepts you're already connecting with. So secondary loss is the idea of all these ripple effects that follow an experience of loss. So whether that's a death, and that primary loss would be seen as that person dying, and then we're grappling with all of those secondary losses that ripple out from that, all the ways that life continues to change. Maybe that means that the roles within family has shifted. Maybe that means that primary support is no longer there for someone. With a non-death loss, it could be a move or a job change, and all of the ways that then your connection to support and community, income maybe changes. All of the friends, maybe you have children that are also adjusting. So there's a lot of different elements here with secondary loss. And I think this can sometimes be underrated. In the sessions that we have with clients, there are a lot of discussion about secondary losses, just as much as someone's processing the death of someone or a major change in their life. They are also grappling with all the ways in which they're having to shift, and find new routine or find new purpose. Ambiguous loss is an experience where there we're losing someone who is either still physically present but psychologically changed, or the inverse, that they're psychologically, they feel emotionally, we maintain that emotional connection to them, but they're not physically present with us anymore. And so dementia is often an example of this that a lot of people can connect to, where someone is physically present, but their symptoms have increased, their connection to other people has changed. In fact, their personality may have changed. This also is often equated to people with severe mental illness or with substance abuse disorders. So there's a lot of ways that ambiguous loss can create a very difficult grief response, and is going to be different than someone who may be grieving someone in a different way. The inverse might be a deployment, or even during COVID when we weren't able to travel to out of town relatives as easily, or at all. When people were in skilled nursing facilities, but we weren't able to visit in person. And sometimes even getting a phone call or a video chat was impossible because of staffing and other concerns. So there's a lot of ways that ambiguous loss can impact our lives in ways that are still being kind of highlighted. This is still an area of grief that is really deserves more space and deserves more recognition. Anticipatory grief is a sense that while we don't ever know exactly when any of us will die, we have a sense now that it's sooner than later. Um, or in a non-death related experience, it may just be that anticipation of what we know will be true. But there's still some undecided or unknowns. So anticipating a large move or even, maybe auditioning for something or preparing for a major job career change, starting a business, some of those anticipations of what's coming and all the fears that might be connected to that. And also what is being lost as we're working towards these big moments of life. Certainly in our hospice bereavement program, a lot of people have faced anticipatory grief, and this can really start when someone is first diagnosed. It could start when someone is first given their prognosis. Um, but this is an aspect where folks can receive some additional support from a hospice team, from a medical team, just encouraging some conversations to be had not only about what your wishes are, but also being able to say goodbye, being able to say, I love you. Those can be some really important ways to address some of the anticipatory grief symptoms. Cumulative grief is another aspect of COVID that really comes up, and that it's that continuous experience of loss after loss after loss. And really, I really appreciate this image because it starts to feel so heavy that one loss after another starts to build up. And maybe we had some resilience initially, but it starts to really wear down, and we might wonder how much more we can take. And it can be really difficult to then take an opportunity to look back and really address all of what happened. And I think we're kind of at that point with COVID where we look back and there's some pieces that maybe have gone by the wayside. We've kind of softened in our memory, and others that really stick out to us and are still part of us moving through the world now. Traumatic grief is just an acknowledgement that there's a saying that within every trauma there is grief, but there is not always trauma in an experience of grief. So there's an acknowledgement that some grief is more sudden, more traumatic for people. They'll name that themselves. And it even could be in situations where something is expected and yet it feels traumatic. Even with breakups or divorces, if it's unforeseen, it can be really rapid and a lot to adjust to. And people will talk about these changes in ways where they identify trauma. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time to get into coping and ideas on supporting other people. Um, but when we talk about coping, what does that really mean? What does that really look like? When I talk about coping with grief, I don't mean that you're able to smile every day and that you're doing great. Coping means that you're just balancing from one moment to the next, what you need, what's real for you in that moment, and trying to get into the next moment. So I think that it can be a bit of a misnomer that coping well means that you're just operating as usual. In fact, that doesn't actually acknowledge the reality of what's taking place, right? We don't want to avoid or just numb ourselves all of the time. There's aspects of grief where that's required from moment to moment, but not as a standard operating system. So I think this self-care plan can be really helpful as a bit of a roadmap, just selecting things to attend to nourish you, and also to distract you, because we do need those moments to kind of fill our own cup without focusing on whatever that grief looks like in that moment. So attending to means that you're really acknowledging, you're letting that grief in, and you're letting it out. Maybe you're talking to someone who's going to listen without commenting on their own experiences. Maybe writing it down or drawing it out is helpful. These are just examples. It's going to look different for everyone, and for every loss. Nourishing may mean really focusing on that sleep quality and taking active steps to support that. It could mean focusing on your hydration or your nutrition. Maybe it's moving your body. maybe you recognize that you do feel better after you've moved your body and however that feels good to you. But it's hard to do. And so that's something you want to focus on. And then distractions. What are some positive distractions that help you just have a break from your grief? Maybe it's watching TV or movies, reading a book. Um, I think with anything content wise, we have to be careful because so much of it is based off of grief and loss. There's that can often be at the cornerstone of a plot. Playing music or video games, and then planning something to look forward to. This is where we start to integrate what has happened to us in our past with what we're moving into in this life ahead. Some other tools to take with you, and these are really more for in the moment coping when maybe the intensity of your emotions or your thoughts are really rising up and it's getting difficult to stay focused. So using some mindfulness, just really attending to the present moment, not judging what's happening in the present moment, but just paying attention to it. Um, these practices can include meditation, imagery, or visualization can really be a helpful way for people to connect to this, or even a body scan, just going through from head to toe or from your toes to your head and identifying any areas of your body that you might need to release. Grounding really helps you kind of get out of your mind and back into your body. And so you can, in that way, you can use your surroundings and the textures that you feel or the sounds that you hear in order to get out of your thoughts, especially if they're kind of swirling, and instead get into the environment and remind yourself that you are safe in this moment. Breath is a wonderful thing because you always have it with you. That's always a tool that you are carrying with you. And so you can always use that to really tune in to your body. But even just activating different senses. Some people will put a piece of candy in their mouth and focus on that. Some people will just step outside or go into a different space so that that change of scenery is helpful to them. And I'd be remiss to not mention gratitude. It can feel really difficult to access gratitude when we're grieving, but the truth is that this can really help build our resilience. And remember that there almost always is something to be grateful for, even when we're feeling really down or really sad.
Hi. Just another person who was saying how much they loved the last diagram. And they just said in their own experience that adding to maybe the last category, like laughing or watching a comedy, that they found that to be helpful as well.
Yeah, definitely. There is this trick in our brain where even when we fake smile, that initiates a response in your brain that's positive. And so that can actually be helpful to you, even if you're fake laughing or you're or you're just smiling to someone who's walking around outside and you come across them on the path. So, since our time is so short, I'm just trying to make sure that I touch on all of these resources so that you have an idea of what you can go back to. And you're also welcome to reach out to us and we can cover anything else again. But this is one of the most useful handouts that we share with people who are trying to support someone that they know, but maybe struggling for what to say and what to avoid saying. So I've just selected 3 examples from this handout. It's a double-sided handout, so there's many more. But what I appreciated about so much is that it gives an idea of what many of us probably have said in the past, and even in that moment felt that it wasn't quite right. So I know what you're going through. Let me know if there's anything I can do, and how are you? We can be in these situations where we feel a little awkward, we feel obligated to say something, and there are no words sometimes when it comes to grief. So, but there are other times where you really feel like there is something that you need to say and you're struggling. So this worksheet can really help because it explains why these statements might feel like they're not hitting home, and then also offer some alternates, different ways that you might be able to touch base with someone and express, your condolences or touch base with them, see how they're doing. The reality of supporting someone really is just, it comes down to acknowledgement. Acknowledgement means that you are directly addressing, you're acknowledging the fact that they have experienced a loss, that you know that this is real for them, and that you also, maybe this presentation helps, but you can understand why they may not be themselves lately. You can understand that this experience is going to be unique for them, it is going to be different for you. So acknowledgement is a big part of this. And these are just some stills from an animation from a psychotherapist named Megan Devine. And she talks about how we have this tendency as a society to try to kind of talk people out of their feelings, out of their grief. And so you'll see, this rabbit is throwing rainbows at the bear, trying to get the bear to feel better because that makes us feel better. It's hard for us to see people that we know and love not doing well. But actually, what ends up happening is a wall starts to form because that person doesn't feel validated, that person doesn't feel heard. What's wrong with me and my grief? This is what's real for me right now, and you're trying to talk me out of it. You're trying to take it away. And really, what Megan says is more helpful is just to sit there with them, to acknowledge that that's where they're at right now, and that that's okay, and that you're there with them. They don't have to be alone. And that often can, instead of building a wall, it can cause them to open up. It reassures them that there's someone there that's not going to judge them for where they're at. So this is where platitudes can be really difficult, kind of land in a way that doesn't feel like they're really resonating with folks. But I love her line. It makes things better even when they can't be made right. So we can't take this grief, we can't take this loss away from them, but we can make sure they know they're not alone, and that can make things better, even if it can't be made completely right again. So there's a lot more where all this came from. The Wilson Support Center is a grief and loss center for Western New York. So we offer phone consultations to people who are trying to kind of navigate these next steps in their grief, or for folks that are seeking to provide support to others who are grieving. We can offer a lot of counseling and group referrals. We are based out of Buffalo, but we also collaborate with the Rochester Hospice Bereavement Team and the Center for Compassion and Healing based out of Rochester. So we can work together to identify what you need depending on where you reside. We have a lot of supportive literature, both that we've developed and also really great resources that we've identified from other wonderful organizations. And so we are always able to tailor what we provide to folks based off of what they're experiencing. We also have some therapeutic worksheets for adults, for teens, for children, as well as some recommended reading lists that can also be really helpful. And then I provide a lot of informational presentations to partners in our community in all sorts of different industries, trying to create a more grief-aware community. The Wilson Support Center also delivers the hospice bereavement program for Erie County. So if you or someone you know is connected in Erie County, it's our team that serves that program. The best course of action, if you're wondering, what you might need or how we might be able to help, is just to give us a call. I have our phone number and our email address here so that you can reach out with any questions that you have, maybe your own story, and just take it from there. We can see how we can best support.
Wonderful. We have plenty of time for questions if people have any questions. And those strategies are wonderful. And I love the gratitude one, even in the midst of grief and loss that's such a, lovely word and such a great opportunity.
Yeah, I think gratitude can be even part of a daily practice, where folks can kind of create their own personal ritual to connect with their grief, and also connect to that gratitude in a way where you're intentionally making time to really get in touch with both where the pain is as well as where the support is.
Yeah, absolutely. And we had a question, someone was thanking you. And then we also had someone ask, what if coworkers aren't empathetic?
So if I'm grieving and I feel like my coworkers aren't supportive, or understanding, I think that's honestly a whole nother presentation.
Hmm.
Um, there's a real there's a real movement around workplaces to create a more supportive environment in general, because grief is such a part of our life. If you stay anywhere for any amount of time, there could be a moment where you're needing some support in varying degrees. Um, Bereavement policies are one aspect of that, but I think a lot of people will say that it's their team culture, it's their manager that really makes the difference at the end of the day. And so I think if you're in that position where you're feeling like your colleagues aren't understanding of what you're going through, perhaps you can go to your manager if you feel like they would be a good sounding board. Just make them aware of what's going on and how, maybe even offer some ideas of how you might feel more supported. I think I know a lot of what people share is just having flexibility around their work as much as possible. Now, you all work in a medical center, so that for some of you, that may be more or less an option. Um, but then also just encouraging maybe some awareness about grief and loss, and what that can look like, normalizing time off in general, but especially around grief and loss, needing a break, needing an adjustment in your workload or your structure, just looking for those accommodations where possible. But yeah, it can be hard to change other people, right? Especially when you're grieving and you're already handling so much yourself, but then to try to teach other people how to be supportive. Um, if they're not receptive to that, then it's really difficult to get through.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have another question. Are your services available in Rochester? Is that something that you
Yeah, so
touched on?
the hospice bereavement services are just part of Erie County. But we make all of our referrals available, our literature, our presentations, our phone consultation is available throughout Western New York, the 8 counties of Western New York. So, um, and if there's ever a situation where we don't have as many resources listed for an area, then we'll collaborate with area grief support services as well. So a lot of the hospice bereavement programs will work together even for folks who don't fall under that program.
Awesome. And we have more thank yous, the what to say and what not to say when someone is grieving. I know that was my favorite one as well. And we also have somebody who said, how does one stay focused at work when a wave of grief hits you unexpectedly?
If you're in a space where you can take a break, shut your door, go into the bathroom and have that moment, I think that's always the preferred, is to actually let that happen because it's normal and it's part of the whole experience. We're never going to know exactly when that grief will be activated. There's always going to be moments where it surprises us. So if we can be true to those emotions in the moment, that's ideal. But the reality is that a lot of times we can't, right? And so we can talk to people about, instead, trying to, whether it's ground in the moment and try to redirect your thoughts, but knowing that you're going to make time later that day to get back to that, right? Because that was important. That's something that we want to kind of process through. Grief really, it is processed through that movement of emotion. And so that's something that I would keep in mind if you're feeling like you need to kind of put a cap on it, is to find a time later to take that cap off.
I love that. Yeah. And the last question that we have as of now is, what if you know someone who is grieving a death by suicide? It's very specific and so specifically difficult to come to grips with. Do you have any suggestions there?
You know, um, I think one of the themes with suicide is the question of why. And that's something that a lot of people can get they can process that within a support group. I think that that's what I've heard from people being most helpful, is to be with other people that can help them see different perspectives and deal with any guilt that might be on their own heart around, what I should have or could have or would have done or said differently. Um, but really, suicide, just like any cause of death, the way that people grieve that is going to be different.
Mhm.
So even within those shared experiences of loss, there's still very unique paths through that. And it really is it's dependent a lot on what that relationship looked like, what your own loss history looks like, what your personality is, what your social support system looks like. That's where it's really hard to make any assumptions about where people are at and where they're going. I remember, I'll just use a quick example. I remember calling a young man who was in his late 20s and had lost every one of his family members. And I was calling him to touch base after he lost the final one. And I had my own assumptions about how that was going to go and how much he would be struggling. And when we spoke, I was struck by how he had built this amount of resilience. He had
Mhm.
been able to normalize grief as a part of life in a way that, people in much later decades still struggle to do. He unfortunately had that amount of life condensed into a couple of decades, and had found his way of understanding and processing through all of those very different losses, and had built an amazing support system around him. So even though he didn't have any true blood family members left, he had built other friendships and chosen family in
Mhm.
the meantime. And so that really served as a moment for me to remember as a professional that I don't know where people are at. And so I hope that sharing that is helpful to all of you. That we can never assume that someone's doing great because they've been through a lot of hard things. This might be the thing that they feel especially broken about. So just trying to avoid those assumptions as much as we can.
And I love the word that you used, resiliency. It's one of my favorite words. And I feel like it's so corny. Like, of course, as a social worker, that's, one of your favorite words. But it is, and it's so true. And sometimes I feel like we don't give ourselves as humans enough grace, but also like recognize that we can do really hard things.
Yeah.
And again, it sounds really corny, but it's true. We really can, and how powerful of that person to, in that moment almost kind of teach us a lesson too, right? Instead of us, supporting them. It sounds like they were really supportive of us in that way, which is really cool. So we have a couple
Yes.
more questions coming in. Let's see. What tips do you have around experiencing grief for things that are not only outside of your control, but maybe haven't happened yet? So I think you kind of talked about like that anticipatory grief. Um, and they said the example was like Hurricane Milton devastation.
Yeah. So when there's still a lot of unknowns, right?
Yes.
That kind of, yeah. Um, I As much as you're able to really honor those emotions that are happening for you right now, and then to realize that there is discomfort in feeling the vague space of not knowing. When we think about it, that's actually a very big part of being human, is that there's a lot of things that we don't know. There's a lot of things that we can't control. And yet those are the spaces we feel really uncomfortable in. And so we find all these other ways to reassure ourselves that we have control, and to find meaning of things so that it feels more known to us. So I think that that's a really prominent theme that comes up in my mind around some of those pieces of ambiguous loss, of anticipatory grief. Um, and as much as possible, just, so those are also coping strategies to find the control that you have, to what while also trying to give up what control you don't have,
Mhm.
just kind of being honest about where that limit is. Um, and then also um, preparing however you feel you need to or can, and in this moment, whether that's practical pieces or even just emotionally seeking out, I anticipate that I'm going to need more support, or I anticipate I'm going to need more time to myself. kind of being real about your needs and what you're capable of right now.
It's almost kind of like what comes to mind for me is like emotional safety planning, right? If I feel this way, then I will, and kind of pulling out those tools in your your toolkit. We can't plan for everything, but finding what we can control and, focusing on that, but also kind of leaning into the fact that you're right. There's so much unknown in life, right? Like every day, every day.
Every day. Mhm.
So let's see. So we kind of have two people asked a very similar question. So I think I'm just going to kind of summarize, but it's pretty much, how do you take care of yourself while taking care of other people? And also, if you are also grieving, how do you navigate then helping somebody else who's grieving and not kind of be, succumb by or overcome by grief and loss?
Yeah. Um, the short answer is boundaries.
Hmm.
I think, again, being true to what, looking inward and being true to really what you are capable of right now. Um, and being honest about that, not only with yourself, which might mean that you're disappointed in some way or another, and that's okay. You know, we're disappointed sometimes. Um, but ultimately, that's the healthy thing for me is to set that boundary. Even though I'm disappointed by it, that's the healthy thing for me. That's what I need right now. That doesn't mean forever. That just means right now, and I'll reevaluate. And then the second step is communicating that to someone, and they may also be disappointed. And I think that's where some discomfort can happen. And that's what often that fear of discomfort is what causes us to go beyond our boundaries. But what ends up happening when we do that is that we resent ourselves, we resent that person, and then we're burned out. And also there might be an expectation that we just continue to do that, right? And so as difficult as it is to do that work ahead of time, it can really pay off. And there's a lot of modeling that happens there as well. So that really goes for both scenarios, whether you're grieving or you're just taking on a lot right now. So what are also countering, maybe what you've been asked to do to help out um, feels like too much or feels like it's too sensitive right now. So, what are some alternatives that you can offer that you feel good about and might still be really meaningful to that person?
Oh, I love that idea of countering, recognizing your boundaries, but also still like giving yourself autonomy, but then also still, respecting and being supportive of that other person. Oh, I love
Yeah,
that.
I I think this can be especially hard for people who really have a strong identity as a caregiver, because it can feel like a failing. It can
Mhm.
feel like there's this loss of identity or this loss of purpose, even loss of self-esteem. I mean, all of those can be, this knotted up ball of complexity.
Hmm.
Um, but that's one of the most important lessons that I think a caregiver can learn is to take care of themselves. And so often boundaries are part of that in order to make sure that you have some wherewithal to give.
Absolutely. Yeah, how can we kind of take care of other people if our tank is empty?
Or we're constantly being activated
Hmm.
and then they have to take care of us. I mean, if we play that scenario out and I do something that I really don't feel like I have the capacity for, I feel like I'm just so sensitive right now. I feel so raw. And then I am activated when I go out and do what they've asked me to anyway. Now that person who's also hurting is put in a position of having to care for me, and that probably isn't going to make me feel great either.
Right.
So yeah, there's a lot of scenarios, and it can be helpful to talk this through with people so that um, you're actually putting yourself in that position of being thoughtful and intentional instead of just kind of going with it and wondering why you're feeling exhausted, wondering why you're feeling like no one asks about you, cares about you, supports you.
Absolutely. My gosh. Good thing this is recorded. Should be taking notes. These are so much such great suggestions. So the last question we have is so they gave a very specific time frame, but I'm wondering if we could just kind of open it up to say, if you've experienced a traumatic loss and a certain number of years have gone by and you're still grieving and having those really intense emotions about it, do you have any suggestions?
Yes. So I think the first thing is just to say, grief really isn't something that truly ends. And that can be
Mhm.
hard to hear sometimes. But what I mean by that, and I'm glad that this person differentiated the idea of having really intense emotions, years and years later, because that's different than a grief that, we're continuing to kind of integrate. There are times where it's still being activated, but we're finding ways to, pay tribute to the memories and to that person and the significance of that relationship, but also continuing to engage with life as it moves forward and finding meaning and even joy in some of that. Um, so that's different than having a continued set of intense grief symptoms. Um, and I mean, long story short, my suggestion would be to increase supports, really to consider a counselor who has a specialty in grief and loss, who has a specialty in trauma, and can really help to start getting into either those memories, those recurrences, those symptoms, in a very skillful way, so that there can be some relief, because it's a long time to be living with something so intense. So definitely someone who's reputable and can be a positive support moving forward.
I appreciate you saying that it does take time and that it's not, linear and okay, after a month or, a year, you should be in this place. And, I kind of joke with some of my clients that I'm sure there's thousands, if not maybe, millions or hundreds of thousands of books written about grief, right? But that's related to you and in your situations. And you mentioned so many different things of your experiences and how you've handled grief in the past. Have you lost anyone in the past? How old are you, right? Like there's so many different factors that come into play that it isn't just, okay, it's been 6 months, you're over it and you're the happiest you've ever been in your life. I mean, that could potentially be amazing at the same time, just not realistic.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a fine line between, okay, our and we see this all the time, is that people may, for a lot of different reasons, may need to kind of operate in that survival mode for quite a while.
Mhm.
And that could mean years, And so 3 years, 5 years later, they're actually contending with the truth of how this has impacted them. So I commend anyone who's saying, yeah, I need to consider something different. I need to ask for more help. I need to start this because my life is important enough for this, right? That's really hard to do, and but that really is the first step in order to start to process what's happened, especially when it comes to trauma.
Absolutely. Well, that was the last question. So thank you so much. What I'm going to do, whoever registered for this presentation, I'm going to send out the resources that you sent via email. You gave a handful of wonderful ones. So I will just send those out to the list of attendees. And if they have, any other questions, you had your contact information up already, and they can just reach out to you directly or your organization directly.
Absolutely. And one of those handouts is directly from our organization, the Wilson Support Center. So it will have, our basic contact information. If you do send an email or leave a voicemail for us and mention me in this presentation, then I'll make sure that it gets to me so that I follow up directly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This
Thank
was
you.
so lovely. The strategies were wonderful and all, I would say, you're not telling people to, all of a sudden go out and like train for the Boston Marathon, right? Unless they want to, of course. It's maybe just find gratefulness, right? Or read the book that's been on your nightstand, right? It's not going to cure the situation, but bring you some relief through this really challenging time. So thank you.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me. It really means a lot to us to highlight these topics.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, I hope you all have a great day. This is being recorded and will be placed on our website at a later date. And I will send those resources your way via email. So I hope you all have a great day and enjoyed your lunch period. And lunch period, oh my gosh, it like brought me back to like high school, your lunchtime. And we will see you next month. All right. Thank
Thank you.
you. Bye.